Today we're going to be talking about chapter 11, section 1, and it's called the Byzantine Empire. And so, 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist. It's not that the people, suddenly disappeared, though there are some really neat stories of groups of people who disappeared. And we'll talk about that later. But this is really just a system of government that collapsed in 476 AD. However, the Byzantine Empire, the system of government that existed there, continued and flourished for another 1,000 years. So, Rome officially divided just about a generation before its collapse. And it was a wise decision because Rome had just become too big to manage. And it was decided that it could be more effectively managed if it were broke up into two cooperating but separate political entities. And this began the Eastern Roman Empire, more commonly known as the Byzantines. Yes, sir?
Can you move the stand?
Yeah. So, more commonly known as the Byzantines or Byzantium. The most famous emperor of the Byzantine Empire was a man named Justinian. He became emperor of the city of Constantinople in 527 AD. In fact, during his reign, much of the former Roman Empire had been conquered once more, and there was a temporary rebirth of Rome in its former glory. The Byzantine Empire was, like the Western Roman Empire at this time, a Christian empire, meaning there was no separation of church and state. They were a kingdom of Christians based around Catholicism. And really, Catholicism wasn't considered a denomination at this time. It was just all of Christendom was lumped into this one category. Catholic just means universal. So the heads of state were also the heads of churches. And while, yes, it's a rebirth of the Roman Empire, it's not democracy in the sense that we would think. Often these folks are used rather brutal policies. But as you can see on the map here, during the reign of Justinian, all of what was once the Roman Empire, at least much of it, was reconquered. Not all. Germania, the Frankish kingdoms, Britannia, Spain, all of these places that were once part of Rome remained independent. But now, when we talk about heads of state being heads of a religion, it doesn't often end well, as you can see in the picture. So if you're an Assassin's Creed fan, I know I brought them up a bunch in the course, there are some Templars being burned at the stake by...
Burn the Templars. It's that one, and that's me in the blood.
It's
a fire.
Okay.
It's a fire.
So the point being of showing you this picture is when you have a theocracy or a nation built around a religion or an ideology, those nations don't have a history of being tolerant toward other peoples. It's not always the case. I just wanted to show you this picture to explain that it does happen. Okay, so what was life like in what they were calling the New Rome? So during the reign of Justinian, he sought to update the 12 tables, the old Roman law, and he called his new updated law the Justinian Code, named it after himself. Super humble, I'm sure. But this set of laws would have 4 main parts and would last for 900 years, meaning that the system of government would remain in place. These laws would remain the law of the land for a very long time. Yes, ma'am?
So there was a number 1 for the notes on the other side, and then there's one...
Because there's 2 answers.
Yeah, there's just 2 answers.
Oh.
Yeah. So in terms of taking your notes, you don't have to write everything you see. That what I'm looking for is to see that you've taken notes related to the concept, and then the numbers that you'll see are keyed to the notes to help you identify, okay, these are some things related to what you're seeing. So Byzantium was a powerful empire under the reign of Justinian, and he used some of this wealth to create a beautiful capital city named Constantinople after the famous Roman Emperor Constantine. And you can go there today. It's been renamed Istanbul, and it is the capital of modern-day Turkey. Yes, sir?
What happened to Constantinople? Why did they change the name?
It was destroyed. We'll talk about that soon. Yeah. So within Constantinople, the wealthiest city of the wealthiest empire in its time, they built an incredibly beautiful church. And it's called the Hagia Sofia, or the Church of Holy Wisdom. And now it's been conquered by different people. They preserved the church because it was so beautiful, but now that church is a place, a special place for a couple of different faiths. But the Byzantines, meanwhile, preserved the Greco-Roman tradition and culture, continued to speak some of these Latin-based languages, and continued some of the traditions. This is the Hagia Sophia as it's seen today. Now, you can see, if you were to look at this closely, it's beautiful. You'll see Christian symbols and you'll see Muslim symbols. And so this place was actually conquered by a group known as the Turks much later. And the Muslim people have a tradition of tolerance toward conquered enemies, meaning they don't force people to convert. And so this did become a Muslim mosque, which means a church or a religious place of gathering. So that's the Muslim symbols you see here. So anyway. So what was life like in the New Rome? And I know some of you guys are doing projects on that. So I just thought it would be neat to talk about it a little bit. So first off, it was a very commercial city. It was an economic hub. People were traveling from all over the world to come here to do business, to sell goods, to buy goods. It had the largest stadium. It had its own version of NASCAR. It was called the Hippodrome, and it could hold more people than any other structure on the planet. So the Hippodrome hosted chariot races, races of all kinds, horse races, foot races, but the most famous were these chariot races. And they were brutal. People often died, not only amongst the participants, but amongst the spectators. It was the NASCAR of its time.
Wait, how were the
I mean, have you ever seen like rival fans like at a game?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Football
It
game.
can get violent, and this was no exception. So, at one point, a race grew so violent, and the fans began to riot that it started and erupted throughout the entire city, and they began to set parts of the city on fire. So, if you think fans get passionate, I just hope they don't start burning cities down as a result. So anyway, that kind of happened, and the government wound up going in with soldiers and had to restore order violently. Justinian's wife was an equally capable monarch. The Empress Theodora served as a wife and advisor to Justinian. And so this is a relief. It's a style of painting or a mosaic of just lots of little drawings put together like a puzzle. So that's the Empress Theodora. So when Justinian died in 565, there were a number of crises after his death. For one, he spent most of his reign campaigning to conquer and to reconquer so much of the former Roman Empire. And he did, and it's incredible what he managed to achieve. But that's also very expensive. And so the empire was nearly bankrupt. But secondly, the Bubonic Plague. And we'll talk more about this later, but the Bubonic Plague stayed around for hundreds of years.
The plague doctors are so cool, though.
So, yeah, I mean, there's neat stuff related to the plague. It's terrifying when you think about it, because with no modern medicine, occasionally the plague would get worse and kill lots of people, and then it would subside. And then a new variant would come out, and it would get worse and kill lots of people, and then subside. So, yeah, it goes in waves. And it lasted for hundreds of years. And so, occasionally, it would wipe out large numbers of people, and then a new variant or a new strain, and yeah, gives us great hope, right? Yeah. So, the second problem is not only were there financial troubles, not only was there a pandemic, there were also rivaling groups. Lots of outside peoples that were constantly attacking and raiding and pillaging the border towns. And it got to the point where the Byzantine military was so stretched in trying to fight these constant struggles that they were often bribing tribes to stay away. They would go to raid a village, and the village would pay tribute, or they would bring out a sum of treasure, and then the tribe would go away. New tribe comes, same principle. And so this is a practice of using bribery to keep peace. But the city of Constantinople, even amongst all these troubles, remained the wealthiest and most powerful city of the ancient world. It had walls that it was once said you could drive a chariot on top of the walls. These thick, tall, impregnable fortress-like structures. They had a fleet, a navy that could rival any other power at the time. And they were also ideally located so that when we look at Constantinople, and I'll try to find it on the map in just a moment, you'll see that it is right between the Black Sea, which is the southern part of Russia, and the Mediterranean. So the Black Sea connects to the Mediterranean by a little sliver of water called an isthmus, and that's a sliver of water connecting two larger bodies of water. And so the city is right there on top of this little body of water. And they could stretch a chain across from one side to the other. And if ships didn't pay the tax, they didn't get to go through. There are tons of people living along the Black Sea, and so people want to get through. And that was one of the ways that Constantinople grew wealthy. But because it was so wealthy and so strategically located, it was constantly under attack. People from all over the world wanted to control that narrow waterway. And so eventually a group called the Turks did manage to destroy the city of Constantinople. in 1453. Now, Byzantine was Rome, and Rome was Byzantine in some ways. But these are different parts of the world. And they began to, over time, develop different cultures and identities. And one example of this is the first major split in the Christian faith. And so, religion evolves depending on the way that the people live who are practicing it. And the religion of the Eastern Empire evolved differently than the religion of the Western Empire. One of the major disagreements was over the use of icons. So if you remember from learning about Islam, Muslims do not create images. All of the artwork that I showed you related to Islam was either calligraphy or architecture. They simply do not create images. But Christians have some disagreement about this. Some people believe that it would be idolatry to create an image of the divine. Some people have no problem with it. So, meanwhile, icons or religious images like pictures of Jesus or God or any of the prophets or what have you are commonly used by Christians of the Eastern Orthodox faith. Catholics, that is the Western side of Christianity, forbid the use of icons or images in religious practice. So it's still a subject of disagreement because some people still, and again, this would just explain one denomination of Christianity versus another. They both still consider themselves Christians. They just had a major disagreement over this that led to the very first split affecting millions of people. On the eastern side, going with the Eastern Orthodox Church. On the western side, going with the Catholic Church. So meanwhile, the eastern side had their own leader called a patriarch, very similar to what a pope does. They are the head of their order. In fact, in the past few years, the Eastern Orthodox patriarch met with the current pope, and it was one of the first times in centuries that these two religious leaders met and spoke. Now, they didn't come to any formal agreements. They didn't rejoin the two churches. They just talked. And that's the first time that's happened in centuries. So it's a pretty big deal. When this split happened, for one, the Pope of the Catholic Church excommunicated the Eastern Orthodox faith, saying they were no longer part of the church. And the Emperor of Byzantium, who sided with the Eastern Orthodox Church, was excommunicated by the Catholic Church. And in Catholic doctrine, and maybe it's not as strict now, but at this time, they maintained the belief that if you were excommunicated from the church, that you were sentenced to hell. Oh. And so the Pope sentenced the Emperor of Byzantium to hell.
Oh.
So
the Pope was like technically all-powerful?
In their religious understanding, yes.
So the Emperor was kind of second class to the Pope?
Yes, and in fact, we'll get to more of that in the Middle Ages. But sometimes the Catholic Church would issue what's called an interdiction, which would mean they would sentence an entire country to hell. So that happened a couple times. But in this case, the Emperor of Byzantium was excommunicated. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Can I get water?
Yeah. So a religious split developed as these two separate churches not only disagreed over the issue of icons, but were speaking separate languages, had different religious practices, and the patriarch, not to be outdone by the Pope, excommunicated the Pope. And so in a religious sense, the Pope said, you are excommunicated. You can translate to, you're going to hell. And then the patriarch said, you're excommunicated. Or in the Eastern Orthodox understanding, you're going to hell. So,
I'm going to hell.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really serious curse. And these people, the point is, they don't speak again, for hundreds of years. I mean, there is no relationship between these two churches for a very long time. The official split occurred in 1054. It's known as the Great Schism. And it is the first major denominational split in the religion of Christianity. So there's the West, or the Roman Catholic Church, and then in the East, the Orthodox Church. So meanwhile, the Eastern Orthodox had missionaries of their own. They sent them to the north into what is today Russia. In fact, many Russians are part of the Eastern Orthodox Church even today. They create their own alphabet called the Cyrillic alphabet. And so, for example, if you ever read Russian or any of the Slavic languages, they don't use the alphabet. They tend to use the Cyrillic alphabet. So anyway, this language was meant to be a vernacular, a common tongue. So the Catholic Church maintained the practice of doing all the sacraments and only translating the Bible into Latin. But meanwhile, with the Cyrillic alphabet, the Eastern Orthodox were translating things into a common language that people could speak and read. Yes, sir?
Who created the Cyrillic alphabet? Because it accidentally teaching us.
Saint Cyril. That's why it's named that. Yeah, it's in the book. But that's all I got for now. So you have a little extra time.